Linda is a chemical engineer with a lifelong passion for history. Thank God we have her. As a docent with the Aiken County Historical Museum, she serves as a researcher, lecturer, and tour guide, and assists with exhibit curation. Recent lecture topics have included Aiken's winter colony homes, people and architects, Aiken's churches, and more. She also serves as president of the Historic Aiken Foundation, helping preserve Aiken's heritage. You may have seen her paper, or her picture and her name in the paper in the last year. She is going to kick off our lecture series this year, and the theme of this, and I think that's why we have such a good crowd, is the preservation and restoration of Aiken's treasures. So without further ado, Linda Johnson.
Thank you, Kathy. Yes, today I'm here more in my role as someone who works at the museum. And I do encourage all of you to support the Friends. The museum doesn't get any money from the county to do exhibits or buy things for our collection. It all comes from the Friends. When Kenna asked me if I'd do a lecture, she told me that the topic was preservation, very general topic. What I wanted to do was a lecture on downtown Aiken because I've been researching that a lot. So I said yes, and I said, don't worry, I'll put a twist of preservation on it. So that's what you're getting. What I am going to do is kick off with a little bit of background about historic preservation. I think a lot of people don't know much about it. And I think it's important to understand it so we know why we are where we are with the kind of buildings we have or don't have. I wanted to point out this wonderful photo right here, courtesy of Judge Overstreet from his family. This was the Overstreet store at the corner of Park and Lawrence in the 1880s. It's where Nandina is now. And someone already pointed out to me, he recognized it because this wooden store became the Warneke Bakery that was at that site before eventually the wooden store was torn down and a brick building was put up. So great photo there, I love that one. So on to historic preservation. Historic preservation is a construct of the 20th century. Before the 20th century, people didn't really worry about preserving old buildings, except for some really important ones, you know, like Independence Hall in the US or Notre Dame Cathedral over in Europe. Other than that, they were actually reusing materials from buildings. Back in Roman times, there was a word in Latin, spolia. Spolia was the name for building materials that were taken from one building and reused in another building. That's what they did. They tore down buildings on purpose to reuse the materials. It was like a giant building parts store all over the place. Oh, and this is a great example. This is a wall in Turkey. These beautiful decorations in the wall were actually something torn from a church nearby and used to build a wall. Here's some more examples. The cathedral in Trieste has stuff in its wall from a previous building. Look at this strange little thing in a wall in Greece. And I'm not sure why, but they used a toothed grinding mill to build a wall in Turkey or in Croatia. There's an art historian, Guillaume Dupré, and he wrote a whole book about spolia in Rome. And he wrote in the book that the ancient glories of the eternal city became a gigantic and convenient quarry. Why were they doing this? Why were they tearing down these great old buildings? Well, you know, it's pretty expensive and hard to quarry stone from miles away and haul it into town. It was a lot easier to use what they already had and a lot cheaper. Lest you think they only did that in ancient, maybe medieval times, we do it today. Only we have a new fancy word for it. We call it upcycling. Now, this is a photo. Oh, back. Oh, what did I do? There. This is in London. See this over here? Anyone know what this fence is made out of? Pardon? They have fences all over London made out of the thousands of metal stretchers they produced during World War II. I get it. Stretchers aren't building materials, but I thought it was cool. But there is a whole industry today of reused and repurposed materials. I have a friend who bought an old barn door for the door between her kitchen and dining room. We're reusing barn doors. We're reusing and reclaiming wood for floors. They are taking down buildings and reusing materials like this decorative sculpture in a new building. You can go online and buy these things. So we do that today. And Aiken was no exception to this. Back in the 1800s, there was a nice little home built over on Easy Street. It ended up being purchased by Louise Hitchcock, and she renovated it to make it nice and lease it out to her winter colony friends. It was named Prickly Pear. It is the house that was bought by Fred Astaire's in-laws. And Fred Astaire spent a lot of time there. In fact, there's this photo right there of him practicing a dance routine with his son at Prickly Pear. If someone today tells you, I know where Fred Astaire stayed in Aiken, want me to show you, they're lying. Because in 1955, Prickly Pear was sold and they dismantled it and they sold off the parts. The fireplace mantles, the light fixtures, everything. Walls, pieces of the roof. Prickly Pear is gone. It was a nice winter colony home, and we were taking it down. And around the world, conquistadors who came over to the New Americas tore down the ancient cities that were here, like Tenochtitlan. People over in Europe really didn't care about preserving their drafty castles. They wished they had money to tear them down and build something new. And during World War II, the Allies bombed what was arguably the most beautiful city in Europe, Dresden. They thought about it. They actually really thought hard about, should we be destroying these beautiful buildings? And they decided that's what they needed to do. So when did people start caring about the old buildings? Well, a kickoff in England happened because of the greatest showman, P.T. Barnum. P.T. Barnum went over to England and did a little tour, and he was in Stratford-on-Avon, and he saw Shakespeare's birthplace. And he wrote, while visiting the house in which Shakespeare was born, I conceived the idea of purchasing, removing, and re-erecting the building in New York. Does that sound like P.T. Barnum? Indeed it does. Well, okay, that was crossing the line for the British. And no less individuals than Charles Dickens and Prince Albert got involved to shut down that idea. But it still took another 30 years before England had its first laws about preservation, and those only addressed 50 ancient sites like Stonehenge. It wasn't until after World War II that in England they had a law about preservation of historic buildings. Meanwhile, in the US, we did preserve Independence Hall. And in the 1850s, a group of ladies who lived near Mount Vernon were concerned because Mount Vernon was falling apart. And they formed a committee, raised money to restore and preserve Mount Vernon. And that set the stage for the next few decades where we restored and preserved the homes of wealthy white males. That's all we did for another few decades. It wasn't until 1931 that we had the first historic district in the United States, a place that was recognized not just for one or two homes of someone well-known, but for a whole collection of buildings, and that was Charleston. So Charleston was the very first historic district. A few years later, New Orleans French Quarter followed. Now I want you to imagine, any of you been to the French Quarter? Yeah, I have. Imagine it torn down to make new modern houses or buildings. We would have lost all that. Boston's Back Bay was another example just a few years after that. The National Trust for Historic Preservation, which is a private group, was formed in 1947. And their goal was to start looking for these places in the United States that needed some help in preservation. Unfortunately, that very same year, the federal government passed the Housing Act, and it was called urban renewal. It's where they went in and identified areas that they thought were old and run down and tore them down to build new modern stuff. There were almost 2,000 communities that were torn down in 10 years. And here's an example. This was in New York. It was called Manhattan Town. And those are some pretty cool looking buildings. This is that same area afterwards. They tore everything down to the ground. It wasn't until 1966 that we had a federal law about historic preservation. And then states and local governments started putting laws in place, and they vary all over the country. But they have the underlying goal of recognizing that some of these structures we have are important to our culture and our history and deserve to be protected. So what's this all have to do with Aiken? You were wondering if I'd ever get to Aiken, aren't you? All right. Well, Aiken obviously has gone through a lot in almost 200 years with its buildings. I really like this diagram here. It's from the Historic Resources Survey that was done by the city back in 2010. And it just identifies the areas of downtown and when the construction happened of the buildings that exist today. And there are 1% of them are from before 1850, and it increases to being 80% of them by the 1920s. So a lot of what we have down in the downtown area is actually pretty old. But Aiken, what really drove the development of downtown Aiken is two things not related to the summer colony of Charlestonians coming, or the winter colony coming, or even the Savannah River site coming. What really drove development downtown was fires and, ooh, we want something newer, shinier, prettier. And that whole fire thing happened 4 years after Aiken was founded. It was founded in 1835. You should have that number burned into your brain. In 1839, downtown burned down. Only 18 to 20 stores. I didn't even realize they had that many in 1839. And the pretty new town hall they had just built in the middle of Lawrence Street. Everything burned down. But they didn't give up. In fact, one of the leading citizens wrote a letter that was published in the Charleston paper that said, yeah, you might have heard that our downtown burned down, but don't worry, Aiken is still open for business. He used those words. I'm not sure where they were conducting business, in tents, perhaps? Well, we don't have any pictures of Aiken before the Civil War, at least any that I know of. This is the first real picture that we have of downtown Aiken right after the Civil War. 1869. This was an etching that was done for Leslie's Weekly up in New York. And you can see a lot of things in this picture. First, all the buildings are still wood. Yeah, they didn't really learn very fast. The streets are dirt, but they do have some plank walkways, sidewalks. So if you could just get from one side of the street to the other, you're in good shape. And then see this building right here? They rebuilt town hall right in the middle of Lawrence Street. So it's right there, the middle of the block between Park and Richland. We had our town hall. And it was great because the first floor was used by the city for their business. The second floor was a big meeting room where they actually held the Presbyterian church services for a while. They could have meetings of the school board, everything. So it was a really cute little building. We don't have it anymore. We also had 3 wells right in the middle of downtown. And that's where people would come to get their water. Here's one of them right over here. There was another one right back here, a third. So these are the types of buildings that would have been downtown, little wooden buildings. We know that Wood's drugstore was right there on Lawrence Street, that nice little wood building. E.J.C. Wood was a huge promoter of Aiken. He was always writing pamphlets to send up north. Here was Johnson's Bakery and Confectionery. And they also sold fruits and nuts. And there's a little sign in the window, and we sell sundry goods. They did a lot of things. Another wood building. The best part of this picture, though, is this guy standing here under a magnifying glass. He's got a badge. He's got a gun. This was the sheriff. I don't know why he was there at Johnson's right then. Here is one of those wells. This was the well at the intersection of Richland and Lawrence. I want you to notice something, besides the fact that obviously there's a well in the middle of the street. That's where people would send their servants to get their water. We sometimes think of Richland and Lawrence because we see a map from the early days, a map of this nice grid, and we think of it as wide open streets. They started off with these nice wide open streets. Does that look like a nice wide open street? Not really. So the streets were there in concept, but they weren't well-developed streets in a lot of cases. So here's the earliest real map that we have of the buildings downtown. This is 1884. This is called a Sanborn map, for those of you who might not have seen one. They were fire insurance maps. And the whole point of them was to give fire insurance companies information about buildings so they knew how to insure them. But they are an amazing resource to historians. First of all, they are color-coded. Yellow is a wood building. Pink is a brick building. Blue is this is a really dangerous fire hazard building. Like a blacksmith, a paint shop. Notice they didn't put any of the blue buildings right on Lawrence Street. So you'll see in these pictures as I show you, this is Park on the left, this is Richland on the right, and this is Lawrence. For decades, this is going to be the primary area of downtown that gets developed. Now, how many brick buildings do you see there? Not very many. They just really aren't learning. We have 5 there, 6 actually. So, 7. So this little one right here was the Henderson Law Office. It was built in the 1870s, and we still have it today. It was the very first brick building. We have several other buildings, most of which are still here today. They don't look the same as they did back then. Let me show you some of this. Oh, here's the west side of Main Street, by the way, back then. See, it's kind of looking like a real street with a kind of parkway. And there's the east side of Main Street. See that town hall down there? Town hall is still in the middle of the street. It lasted there for about 30 years. So that very first brick building, this is the earliest photo we have of it, which is actually about 1890. See that little building there? The Henderson Law Office. Today, it is the Tool Law Office on the 2nd floor. Look at how much it's changed, though. They changed the windows on the upper floor. It's all stuccoed. Any decorative stuff is gone. Pardon? But yeah, look at the one next door. It's a little later than the Henderson building, but look how elaborate it was. And as part of what we were doing in the 1940s and 1950s, all that decorative was torn off so that we could make simpler, streamlined buildings that were much more modern looking. And now, there certainly are people who go back and say, wow, I kind of wish it looked like that. I'm not sure about that one, but that's pretty cool. We're going to see a lot of that. This is my favorite find. So, the second building was on Richland, the second brick building was on Richland. It was Dr. Teague's dental office. And this is an actual photo of it, and there's a little sign there that says dentist, right on Richland. And I just thought it had been torn down because I didn't know what had happened to it. And I was walking on Richland taking modern day photos for this presentation. And I thought, wait a minute, Prime Steakhouse. And I went back into the records. Prime Steakhouse is in the second oldest building downtown. I don't know if they even know that. It's changed, certainly. Clearly, at some time, someone put a porch on front and then enclosed the porch. There was this little side addition, some stuff to make the attic more usable. But it's still Dr. Teague's dental office. It's been a hardware store. It's been several things. It was a sporting goods store at one time. I found a photo from the 50s. So once you know to track it, you can find it. Another building that is still there, built 1882, Powell's Hardware. So it's right there in the middle, the dark building with this nice cornice, 1882. And it started out as a skinny building, a one-section building. Only there were some fires after 1882, and it burned down the two wooden buildings on either side. So Powell bought them up and expanded his store to make it a three-part store. So it became this here. And here it is in about 1950. And it still has the cornice, and the cornice still says Powell, 1882. Today, it is the Aiken Center for the Arts. Now, someone took off that cornice. You don't have Powell, 1882 anymore, which is a shame. It would have been kind of cool to leave that up. But when I go inside, I've talked to them, and they said, yeah, you know, we knew it was a really old building. These floors are the original floors. Original floors from the 1880s. Think about that. I can't keep my floors for 10 years. Another building that still exists and didn't get changed is the Croft Block. It's on the west side of Lawrence. You see it all the time when you go downtown. It's the building that Three Monkeys is in. And here it is, about 1890. It was built in 1884. And there it is today. Still has its cornice, all the elaborate decoration. That's an excellent example of just being able to keep a building the way it is. And then there was the Hahn building, which might have still been there if it weren't for an explosion. Yeah, explosions go right in with fires. They destroy everything. So in 1884, also, the Hahn building was built. Hahn was big in the groceries business, and in fact, his grocery store becomes one of the grocery stores to the Winter Colony and everything. In 1953, there was a terrible gas explosion, and it destroyed his store. Actually, he had just sold it. That was the very fortunate thing. A year earlier, he had sold the store. And then there was a gas explosion. And so obviously it destroyed the store and did enough damage to the stores next to it that all three of them had to be torn down. So y'all know the pink building downtown. It says Aiken Drugs, looks really cool. I've always thought that that was one of the really old buildings because it had that cool Aiken Drugs. It's built after 1953. So that's where it was. Okay, let's jump ahead just 5 years. So that was 1884. Now we're just 5 years ahead. How much pink do you see there? A lot more. You know why? Because we kept burning everything down. We destroyed 4 stores up on this block with fires in 1886. We destroyed 9 stores down on this side of the block in 1887. The only one down here that didn't get destroyed was Powell's Hardware right in there that was brick. So, but that's when we start getting some other, they call them blocks when it's a building that has multiple partitions in it. So it will be called a block, and it might actually have 3 storefronts. Just to clarify, no, not everybody's heard that term. So we got the Henderson block on the east side of Lawrence, and we got the Palmetto block, which also gets called the Beckman building. It's the building that today is right there next to the Hotel Aiken that has Vampire Penguin and Ginger Bee and Bayou Bijou. That building was built in 1886. It's in pretty good shape, and they've done a great job with the storefront there. So we had a little building, well, not so little. We had this odd building built about 1886 or so. It ends up on the 1889 map. That was the first major bank building downtown. So everyone know where the Bank of America building is now? Okay, right at the corner of Park and Lawrence. That bank was there first. And it was a really odd shaped bank. This isn't that the photo is weird. This was just an odd shaped, like a slice of a bank. So it ends up being there. Later on, a brick building is built adjacent to it that's about the same height, the Chatfield building. And then when the Farmers and Merchants Bank wants to have their big bank, they tore down the original bank and added on to the Chatfield building to make this. This is the Farmers and Merchants Bank there. And here it is today. So it's another one that retained all of its original ornamentation. Did you have a question? I heard someone talking over there. Okay. Then we have the Henderson block. Henderson block is east side of Lawrence, just south of the Palmetto block there. It's where the Aiken Antique Store is right now. It was a pretty cool looking building. Oh, sorry. Look at that. Only in 1947, they decided, and this is what it said in the newspaper, it's old and ugly looking. You know, we don't like the old stuff. And so the owner literally stripped the entire facade off and built this nice new modern facade. I see some of you frowning, like maybe you would have liked the original. I don't know. This is a great illustration. Tastes change over time. And that's really hard in historic preservation, because just because we like or don't like a building as it was built at the time doesn't change its historic value. So today we might say, we really liked the original, we don't like the remodel job, but you have to look at what the history is behind it. Okay. And the Palmetto block that I already kind of mentioned, we don't have any really old pictures of it. All I have is a little slice of it in a picture of the Hotel Aiken. You can just see it right there. Originally, you know, it was built in the 1880s. It had that same look, kind of the Victorian look, some ornamentation, you know, nice cornice, decorative over the windows and everything. We don't know when, but by 1940, most of that was stripped off and it turned into this. And today, here it is. And they've done a nice job. This is a single building, but they've used color to show the different sections of the building. And here's the east side of Main Street from Lawrence Street going north in about 1900. You can see we still have some old wooden buildings. You know, they haven't burned down yet. Don't worry, they will. But right about here is where the alley is. And from the alley up to Richland is all brick buildings by then. We still have dirt streets, horses. They've taken out those trees they had a few years earlier that were lining here. They've taken those out. I don't know why. And now we're up to 1918. We've jumped ahead a few years. And what color do you see now? We're learning our lesson. Yes, so we have a lot more wooden buildings, a lot of vacant lots that are being built now with brick because they realize that is the smart way to go. Some buildings that are built between 1889 and 1918. We have the Hawley building there. The Bank of Western Carolina, I'll tell you more about that. And the Hotel Aiken that's built in 1898. So here's the west side of Lawrence in 1910. You can see brick, 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 wood. That's right at the corner of Hayne Extension where it comes and dead ends into Lawrence. You know that? And then brick, 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 brick. That wood thing isn't going to last very long. It burned. And they built a new bank there. Now, this bank was even grander than the Farmers and Merchants Bank. I don't know if it was a contest. This gets built just 4 years later. It was 3 stories, and I'll just quote Owen Clary, who used to be the guy here. It had 3 stories, an atrium in the center, marble floors, and a red tile roof. It was magnificent, but it was torn down in the name of progress. It also had a full basement, which I don't know of a lot of buildings downtown, like any, that have basements. It had a full basement too. In 1956 or 1966, they decided that it was just too much. It's too big, it's too old, and they tore it down. I've read the newspaper articles. There was nothing in them about how it was in bad shape. It just wasn't modern. And it was replaced with this. It wasn't SRP originally, I think. It was a different bank. But the little plaza out front and this nice little bank replaced this big thing. Tastes change over time. And then there's the Hawley building. We do still have it. There's the Hawley store back about 1918, I believe this photo is. And here it is today. But you can see it probably started with some decorative features, and those were simplified over time. So what we've ended up with downtown is a mix of some of those old buildings with the elaborate cornices and everything, and some newer buildings that have gone more to stucco fronts and a much simpler kind of design. It's a real mix downtown. Here's the Hotel Aiken. From what I can tell, it may have led the charge on this simpler design and stucco. But I don't have good pictures from the 20s and 30s. So if anyone knows of photos out there of downtown from the 20s and 30s, I would love to see them. So in 1929, it was remodeled. It went from this to this. Stucco, much simpler, all that. What's interesting is that the hotel was built by Mr. Hahn. Mr. Hahn, who had built his store across the street. Here's the hotel, and here's his store. They were built 20 years apart, but he got the same architect to do them, so they end up being very similar. All right, so this is kind of a quiz for you guys. Here are two photos of the east side of Lawrence Street. Here's 1940, and here's about 1952, 53. Do you notice anything on these photos? They're not color-coded. It's not as easy. Pardon? The roof lines have changed. Yeah. Yep. Pardon? Parking meters. Yeah. Street lights have changed a lot. They've raised them up. Yeah, there's this huge change in just 10 years where a lot of these buildings that had the more decorative embellishments have been simplified. They're stucco buildings. This one is going to change. So they're simplified, it's stucco, the embellishments are gone. Yes, there are parking meters. Just recently, the last few months, I've been hearing someone say, what are they going to do next downtown? Parking meters? You know, that would be horrible. They had parking meters downtown and finally removed them. They had to have them back in the 1950s because when they had tens of thousands of workers come to the Savannah River site, downtown got flooded with cars. So they needed to start controlling that. Another thing that you should notice is the names of some of the businesses, and maybe you can't read it from back there. This is the era of the Jewish merchants, where from the 1920s to about 1950, we had Jewish merchants downtown covering everything from shoe stores to dry goods stores. At one time, in the late 40s, there were 50 Jewish merchants downtown. 50. So you have the Saraskis, the Perskis, the Freemans, the Myers, all of these merchants right in this little section. This is just a small section of downtown. All right. So just jumping up a little bit north of that block. I mean, that was just one block of downtown that I've covered. So we're going to be here till tomorrow morning. And someone will kill me like Kenna. No, we're just going to go north a block of Richland. And what color do you see? Yellow. Yellow. This is 1918 too. But at this point in time, almost all those buildings are houses. They aren't burning down. They're not close to each other. They're not replacing their houses. There's one small block of buildings here that were businesses, though. Here's a picture of them in 1940. And here's the picture today. A lot of these buildings are still there. This was Lawrence, just north of Richland. We had Efron's Garage. We had this little white building here, which I don't even know what that is, but it's still here today. Pardon? The barber shop. Thank you. See, I need to get a group of people together to help me identify everything. So we still have a lot of those buildings today. My favorite, though, is the Owens Seed Company right here on the corner of Lawrence and Richland. Today, it's Plum Pudding. Same building. But yeah, apparently everybody knew the Owens Seed Company. Now, let's see. There's one little section of downtown that really caught my attention as I was doing this. You had the main drag there of Lawrence, but just west of Lawrence, along that little western section of Park and the Hain extension, those two diagonal roads, that was a really interesting section because it becomes the land of transportation, if you will. Almost all of these places here, they're livery stables and carriage houses. Here was the funeral cortege of a mayor, and it happens to be along that street. And I was able to match up all the buildings, wood buildings here and one little brick building there. So you had all these livery stables and carriage houses in 1894. By 1909, though, you had some carriage houses still, some livery stables, but you've got a garage and a garage going there. This is a photo from the first post office in downtown Aiken that was also along that block. It was right over here, across from where the post office is now. The big post office we have that isn't a post office anymore, but yeah, there was a little post office across the street. In fact, there it is under construction. We have the old post office, which isn't the really old one. There's an older one. It gets very confusing. But here's the new old post office under construction. Here it is today. And it's a really neat example of what we call in historic preservation of adaptive reuse. If you've never heard that term, adaptive reuse isn't just continuing to use a building for the stuff it's been used for. Like the Croft building was stores originally and it's stores now. Adaptive reuse is when you take a building that was built for one purpose and you save it to use for something completely different. Like a post office used for floors offices. I like my little icons here. So you can see how you have in 1909, you have all the little horse places. Those are little horses there. By 1918, you have some horse places, but you have a lot of car places. Dealerships, filling stations, auto repair places, all on that block. And by 1925, it's almost all cars. In just from 1909 to 1925, 15 years, 16, you have gone from a horse-dominated culture to a car-dominated culture. We think of big grand things, changing towns and everything, fires, but sometimes it's something as simple as, how are you getting around? And in Aiken, how you were getting around changed the downtown dramatically. They took out the hitching posts downtown. They used to have hitching posts everywhere. They took, pardon? Yeah, they had the trolley line. They had to take it out because of the cars, actually. So you went from horses to cars, and it changed downtown. Certainly changed Hain Extension. Here are some photos from then. So this is the north side of Hain Extension. So you're standing about Pendleton Street, a little bit past it, looking towards Lawrence, and that's the north side. You had an Esso station. You had Cullen Tire Company. And then just past that is that big bank that got torn down in 1966. Let's see, I was going to say something else on this one, but clearly not. This is the south side of the same road. Brick buildings. You had the Dodge place. You had Thompson Motor Supply. You had the Chevy place. You had Owens Motor, all along that street. And at the very end of the street, these law offices now? That's where the Gringree brothers had their, I don't remember, which kind of dealership was it? Buick. Okay. None of those dealerships are there anymore. They all moved out to the highway in the 70s and 80s. But they all used to be right downtown, as did gas stations. This just boggles my mind. When I go downtown, I look at my gas gauge and think, oh shoot, I need gas. So I need to drive out this way or down that way. This point in time in the 50s, there were gas stations on every block surrounding downtown. there were so many gas stations. It was no problem. Pardon? You remember that? Yeah. And we don't have any of them there anymore. So some of the places on that block get torn down. This is actually over on Park, where these buildings there got torn down to make the drive-through for the Farmers and Merchants Bank. But here is some great examples of this adaptive reuse that I talked about. This was the Owens Motor Company. Today, it's the Connors House. They restored that. And a Airbnb right there. A motor company turned into residential. That's pretty cool how they reused those. That's on Hain Extension. It's the little bit of Hain that goes diagonally off of Lawrence. Right next to Axe. Yeah, so it's just west of Lawrence. And the Chevy Cadillac place is Axe now. They're on Park. They still have the whole building. Yeah. This was torn down right there. There's the bank, but this part was torn down for the drive-through on Park there. So the Chevy becomes Axe, and this is one of my favorite ones. Where Cullen Tire Company is an empty lot now. This is at the corner of Hain and Pendleton, right there. So the tire part of the business was torn down, and this is Cullen Motor, and they extended out there. This is Osmond's Cleaner now, in that building. And I need to go in there because I understand they still have some of the structural parts inside from Cullen Motor. So I'm looking forward to seeing that. All right, enough of Lawrence and that. Let's talk about Newberry and the alley and Bee Lane. Why the groan? Okay, so this is back in 1899. Remember that town hall that was in the middle of Lawrence Street? It's been moved over to the middle of the block between Lawrence and Newberry, there, right there. And there is no real Bee Lane. I mean, I guess you could walk between the buildings, but there's no real alley there. And here's our favorite, the alley. And here's the waterworks. There's the waterworks where they were pulling up the city water and treating it and sending it out. Yes, it was the middle of Newberry. It wasn't on either side of it. It was the middle of Newberry. But the alley, which was actually called the Boneyard. And yeah, it was called the Boneyard. And it's where all the horse trading happened. People would come in on Mondays, and that's where all the horse trading would go on. And it was really wild. It was the kind of place women didn't walk by choice. Kids didn't walk because their parents forbade them. There was a lot of bad stuff that happened there, I guess. The merchants who were bringing in the horses would be racing them up and down the alley to where the business owners on Lawrence would block off the alley because it was a hazard to pedestrians. In fact, by 1931, they had to pass a city ordinance banning horse trading there because it was too unsavory. So how did we go from this unsavory place to what we have now? Well, by 1918, it's distinct, Bee Lane and Bee Lane going across there, the alley going down, and there's Park and Richland. The waterworks is turned into the city storehouse, but they have a nice water reservoir behind it. That became the city pool a few years later. So I don't know if some of you remember the city pool that was the middle of Lawrence Street. Newberry. We got the Opera House. So there's this new Opera House built in the 19-teens. It's grand and everything, and it actually doubles as the city hall. They have their meetings there, and that it burned down in 1933. A brick building, the brick building that also housed the fire department, burned down. Ironic, isn't it? And then we got our old new municipal building, or new old municipal building, whatever we want to call it. You know, the old muni building there on Park. Here's that theater, the Opera House, which also was called Festone Theater, which it's not really clear to me if some people say it was the Stone Theater and someone did a typo and left out a space between the letters, or it was the Stone Theater because a guy named Stone helped fund it. It doesn't matter. It was on Park, yes. It was the Opera House, and it burned down to make way for a Muni building. The alley was pretty run down until 1980. And I don't know if any of you remember it. I hear about how run down it was. And it was a place that you did not hang out. But thanks to Sam Erb, who, Man of the Year this year, I believe, Sam Erb and Marilyn Revere and others, they decided we can turn this around. And Sam got talked into having a restaurant there, the Bowery. And people told him he was crazy. No one is going to walk in the alley, certainly not at night. 30 years later, he retired, having run a successful business. But he led the way with other restaurants there and other businesses. And they paved the alley. It hadn't been paved. They paved it. They added lighting. Then a few years back, they did even more upgrades. You know, these cute bricks. They made it a pedestrian way. So now the alley is something that we really treasure, but it wasn't always like that. I would like to see the horses running up and down there still. And here's the east side of Newberry. Remember, the middle of Newberry keeps getting used for things, for waterworks, for city shops, for pools. The east side never really develops until the 1950s and 60s, but here was a little theater on the east side of Newberry. Does anybody remember that? Okay. Yeah. And someone told me, oh, they remember it and they really miss that little theater. So I don't know what it was like, but that all got torn down to make the big Amentum Theater, which we do very much appreciate today, right? So going up and around Richland Avenue a little bit, you know where the Holly House is there next to the hotel on Richland Avenue? I said that there were gas stations surrounding downtown. Yeah, the Whittle Brothers garage was right there with pumps right on the street. And just because it's a cute picture, there are the Whittle Brothers themselves in their garage. Thanks to Alan Riddick, he has that photo. And I'll leave you with this. This is Aiken in the 1890s. You're standing just across from the alley, looking up towards Richland there. And that's what you would have seen on a daily basis. We've actually preserved a lot of our buildings downtown, not really because we purposely were trying to preserve them, just people owned them and found ways to continue using them and keeping them up. And we're very fortunate to have that. We have one of the most intact commercial districts of any small town around the South. You know, most small towns lose part of their commercial district, and we have a pretty intact one. And it wasn't really by design, but it was because people kept using their buildings. So that's a good outcome here. And with historic preservation, you kind of hope to encourage people to keep doing that. Thank you very much. Oh. I don't think they had wide angle lenses back then, but you're right, it does. Well, this is 150 feet wide. And that was unusual for downtown. And there are a lot of people who speculate it was a very deliberate design to encourage more open space and fresh air to prevent disease from spreading as much. So. I want to address something that I just heard about Pascalis's plan and parkways. Actually, there's no evidence that for the first few decades there were parkways in Aiken. They weren't put in till the early 1900s. They were just wide open streets. So, questions? Yes.
Turn of the century when they started doing brick buildings, do you have any idea of the source of the brick or those buildings at that time? It would seem like there would be a local source.
I don't know, but that's actually a very good question. Does anybody know? Pete knows. Hamburg. Okay, so Hamburg did have a big brickworks.
And a lot of them called Aiken, Augusta brick was not actually made in Augusta. They're actually made on the floodplain where the dock was in Hamburg. And eventually there was a brick, but I think it was mainly fire brick made in pitch by wood.
Okay.
You still see some of those bricks with the Augusta name on it.
Yeah.
In the sidewalks and everything else, Augusta down to the farm market.
Ah.
But just so you know, all of Lawrence Street, under about that much asphalt was all through. Really?
Yeah.
With Augusta block.
So where did the trolley, right down?
The trolley came from east on Park, turned the corner at Lawrence and went up to Richland, and then headed west from there to go by the Park and the Pines Hotel and down through the valley and over to Augusta.
Was it down the middle of the street or one side?
It was the very middle of the street. Yes. So it started in 1902 and was taken out in 1929 because of cars. Cars were here and everybody could use cars. Yes.
Yeah, some of this half Yankee and half Southern, I can say there was that kind of trouble. The reason why you had wood was because of the War of Northern Aggression, okay? And the place was decimated. You didn't have any money down there. Things started to change when you had the next invasion of wealthy Northerners coming down with their horses in between 1900 and 1920, and then the 1929 crash. What I think is interesting going forward is you have a lot of Yankees bringing their money down here now, which will change the landscape of downtown. That is, to be determined going forward. So I think, I think that needs to be addressed at some point going forward. Maybe your next conversation, your thought is, what is the future of downtown going to look like? How is it going to
You know what? Given my other role, I think I'm going to leave that talk to someone else. We all know how excited everyone is about that topic. So, but thank you. Yeah.
So more of that philosophy of restoration as a building described as goes through an evolution. Often it's a curious look and feel relative to where it started.
Yeah.
Is there, and there is a lot of incentive to basically preserve historic structures. Do we incentivize builders and renovators and so forth to be critical to the original design? Why do we stop at a time and preserve something that might be ugly than what the original building was?
This is a very good question. It's a question that's coming up right now in Aiken. If some of those buildings that changed over time and became stucco, the cornices removed, wow, we liked the earlier building, can't we restore it to that? That is problematic with historic preservation because the renovation is also historic. And what should happen, and I'm hoping we can work with the city to make this happen, someone should be evaluating downtown and making decisions, what era really dominates downtown, and we should kind of focus on that era. I mentioned that we have kind of a little bit of a hodgepodge right now. So people have said, can we tear those stucco facades off some of the buildings and bring back the old facade? It sounds easy, but from a historic preservation, it's not an easy thing to do. You can definitely evaluate it though. Yes?
Security Federal at the corner of Richmond and Lawrence took stucco off. I don't know if you realize that building used to have stucco.
Which corner of Richland and Lawrence? Okay, yeah, the security Federal, right. They did, and I don't know what year they did that. Does anybody know?
It was around 2006.
Okay, yeah, because that's exactly what they did. They went back to the original. So we really need a little more holistic look at downtown. It would be helpful versus looking at buildings, one by one. And I'm hoping we can get to that point. We sometimes get in a really reactive mode of there's this one building and we need to deal with it. And I'd love to take a step back and look at the buildings as a whole. That's what Charleston did. Charleston had to look at their downtown as a district. And what is the flavor of the district? Not, let's look at it building by building. Other questions? Well, thank you very much for sitting here through this.
Before you leave, the Friends of the Museum would like to thank Linda for her knowledge and for sharing it. And we'd like to present her with a copy of this book. If you haven't seen it, it's for sale in the gift shop. This is a book about the museum, about how it was founded, the various exhibits in here. So if you want to know a lot about Aiken County, it's in this book. So thank you, Linda, very much.